So, Michaela, welcome along to the Red Talks. It's been a wee while to get you here, but I'm really glad we have. So I'll just introduce you a wee bit, but then it's up to you. I'll pass it over to you. So you're the lived experience development worker for the Scottish Recovery Consortium. So we're going to hear more about that and the kind of stuff that you do. But how are you doing right now? How you feeling about doing this interview? You okay?
Yeah, I kind of feel fine about it, actually, to be honest. One of the things that I think I've done from dot really, after being 13 years in recovery, is being quite public about my recovery.
Yes,
so, and that was a choice because I thought very carefully about that and who it could affect. Because we always need to think long term. So yeah, I'm feeling okay about it because I've kind of learned what to say and what not to say and what's private and what's
Yeah, definitely.
Because that's quite a danger sometimes, isn't it? That you sort of say too much and then 10 years later you go, oh no, why did I say that?
I wish I hadn't done that. Yeah. But it's a really
Absolutely.
important element because recovery changes and we change as human beings and our jobs change and our lives change. So it's really important. And I know we just spoke about that, you know, once this goes out into social media, then you've got very little control about it. So that's why we're quite careful on who we interview, you know. If somebody's written a book with their whole life out there, then possibly that's okay. But we like people to have, you know, had a decent time in recovery, and you know they've usually done stuff. So welcome. I've says who you are. You know, you want to tell us a wee bit about how you got here to Scotland, to the Recovery Consortium, and the kind of stuff that you do. I've known you as an activist for quite some time, but I'm not aware of your journey and maybe how you got into recovery. What kind of initiated your recovery and that kind of stuff? It's up to you.
Yeah, so it's a long and complicated story, which I will try and put into, so we're not here until Wednesday week. So sort of my, which we could well be, but my sort of my journey really started. Okay, I'll go back to the beginning. I started quite a successful career. I was a volunteer, a VSO volunteer in China for 3 years, and which was both wonderful and very, very challenging. And I think at that time I probably started to use alcohol to deal with loneliness and anxiety and all those sort of things. When I got back to the UK, I ended up, it's like that sort of advert, isn't it? I liked the razor, so I worked for the company. What was that? Rodson or something, wasn't it?
Yeah.
So I ended up joining VSO and starting at quite a sort of low-level temporary job and just getting promoted. And as I got more promoted, my self-confidence diminished, which is, I think, quite common. And the sort of anxiety that I think was a result of adverse childhood experiences just grew and grew and grew. So there was that sort of reverse thing. And to cut a long story short, I was using alcohol. I used drugs, but only recreationally. I mean, I had quite an enjoyable time with drugs, but I think I used drugs. I didn't use drugs in the same way as I used alcohol. So I used alcohol, I suppose, to in the old saying, because I couldn't bear to be in my own life because of the really, really bad anxiety that just gripped me all the time. So long story short, got promoted, and the higher I got, the more alcohol I used to feel remotely normal. Did try and get help on numerous occasions. I think it's probably a common story, sort of batted back, would just stop drinking. You know, I can't believe now, knowing what I know, that I made no link with the alcohol and the anxiety. So I thought it made it better. It didn't, it made it worse. Time went on. It's a bit like that cartoon, you know, where at the end of the cartoon they say that's all, folks, and the screen gets smaller and smaller. Well, that was my life, really. It just got smaller and smaller as alcohol got bigger and bigger. Using alcohol all the time, in the morning, being drunk at work. Well, not drunk, because you're never really drunk. You're just never really sober. As with all things, you can make, the interesting thing about alcohol, I think it's because it's not criminalized largely, is that you can actually maintain, you can go for quite a long time just being that functioning alcoholic, whatever they call it. And I did for a very long time, but the crash came, I got made redundant, which was very kind, really, because I should have been sacked. And, you know, to use a bit of bad language, shit hit the fan. Drank all my redundancy money, lost my house, lost my partner, lost my car, lost my, you know, just lost everything, which actually I don't, in retrospect, was not maybe a bad thing, because I obviously wasn't very happy.
Yeah.
And made a really weird decision, which I still don't really understand, to move to Manchester from London. Go figure. And it was like when I got to Manchester, it just really, really hit me. And also, I think at the same time, the alcohol stopped working. And it was taking me to some really, really dark places. I tried to get help. I ended up making a suicide attempt because I just couldn't bear to be in my own life anymore. And that was the start, really, of getting some of the help, or being taken seriously, perhaps. And I had a community detox, which was fundamentally, here's some pills, go and do it on your own. No support, no nothing, didn't know about mutual aid, none of those kind of things. And at the end of that detox, it was pretty much, if I go out that door, I'm going to die. If I stay here just for 5 minutes, I won't. And that was how my recovery started. In terms of why I became an activist, is I was really angry, actually, John.
Yeah.
I was very naive as well, because I'd always believed, I think, that, you know, if you fell off the world, there were support systems to help you. I'd honestly believe that. I'd honestly believe that, you know, there was benefits and this and this and this, and all these things were there to help you. The reality was they weren't. And my recovery journey was made immensely difficult rather than eased by coming into contact with things like housing and being told I'd made myself intentionally homeless because I was an alcoholic. Benefits, you know, you need to go back to work now, blah, blah, blah. And it was just like, it was all those sort of things. And perhaps the most thing that angered me most is I had no idea about recovery. You know, nobody had ever told me. And it was just by chance that I went to the first recovery walk that was held in Liverpool way back in the mists of time, and I got involved with Wired Into Recovery, which was an online recovery community.
I remember,
And suddenly, well, I'll always say it was particularly on that recovery walk, that was my you know, spiritual awakening, is I saw all these people and I just felt like I'd found my tribe. So driven by sort of joy that there were people like me, and anger that people like me didn't have a chance, really, I became a recovery activist, and my journey sort of started because I felt every single person should have the opportunity to get well, however they choose to do it. So hopefully that sort of covers it.
Yeah, that's really good. So you mentioned, I remember Wired In, and David, what was David's second name? That
Clark.
David Clark. Yeah. He went away. Went away to Australia as well, I think, at one point. Yeah. So know everybody that will watch this will know about the recovery walk. Could you tell? Well, I mean, where the idea came from?
Yeah, I think as with most things, unfortunately, it came from America. And that's a question for ourselves, is, you know, why does our Indigenous recovery movement rely so much on America? And I think that's something to do with the evidence base we need to work on here. But it came from America, and basically just it was in Liverpool because Jackie Johnston Smith, I think, was pretty active doing things there, and it started off as a memorial, actually. And it was held in Liverpool, and it was about 300 people, and that became the sort of seed of the recovery walk. And then I got involved the next year, and it came to the second one was in Glasgow. In Goose Green, and that was amazing. And then it sort of has just grown, and then I can't remember exactly what year it was because I was in England, but then it sort of split. So now there's a Scottish recovery walk and a UK recovery walk. But fundamentally, it's three things for me. It's one, to remember the people we've lost. It's two, to celebrate our recovery and show the world out there that recovery is possible and that we are visible. I think the third thing is just to celebrate together the wonder of being around a group of people of all ages, backgrounds, whatever, where you share one thing, and that's this desire to get well and be the best person you can. And if no one watching has ever been to one, it's not just open to people in recovery, it's anyone who shares sort of what I call recoverist values, which is a recovery activism, wanting everyone to get well. It's like plugging yourself into a massive energy source. The buzz is absolutely amazing. And that buzz comes from people. That doesn't come from alcohol, it doesn't come from drugs. It comes from that sheer joy of being alive.
Yeah. No, that's great. That's really helpful. And I remember one in Glasgow where I think we put the Serenity Cafe had a tent up when we had all the, we had aromatherapy and massage and stuff as well. It was a great walk, that. And then the other one I remember was I had an American in recovery who was over, and he was checking some things out, and the recovery walk happened to be on the Forth Bridge that day. So he was just blown away.
Absolutely.
It was an amazing thing. He came over not expecting any of that, and it's amazing. So that's really helpful. So what kind of things are the Recovery Consortium working on at the moment? And maybe tell us a wee bit more about your role with the people with lived experience as well, and what kind of stuff you're doing.
Yeah, so I would say the Recovery Consortium is now a sort of, it's growing up into recovery now. So it's kind of looking at different things. I mean, obviously at the core of it still is that belief in building communities of recovery, however they look. So it could be things like you mentioned, the Serenity Cafe. It could be what's going on in Forth Valley. It could be what's going on in a small group of people just doing recovery in their area. So one of our key themes for the next 3 or 4 or 5 years is to build, to work alongside people to build recovery communities across Scotland. So I think we've got some really recognisable ones, and we've got ones that are coming up, and we've got areas where there really isn't very much that you could call a recovery community. And I'm sure you'll agree with this, John, is that actually access to that community is what can make the difference between long-term sustained recovery and getting back into that cycle. And while like treatment is important, harm reduction is important, all those things are really important and are all part of the journey, that community element needs to be there. You need to feel like you belong. You need to feel like you've got a tribe, and you need to have a group of people around you who support you to get you to keep going. And even 13 years in, I still rely on the recovery community. It doesn't change, they're my bedrock. So that's one of the sort of key things that we're doing. We've also picked up from the rights, respect and recovery strategy, that whole notion of rights, and we've started to do some work on that, and we'll continue to work on that notion of rights in recovery, because as a group of people, we're not very, maybe because it's self-stigmatization or something like that, we're not always very clear that we have rights. We were the one group that was left out of the protected characteristics. So other people with other conditions are included. We were deliberately left out. So it's kind of a new arena for us so instead of saying, instead of just accepting that we are not worthy, it's about getting people to see we are worthy. We're human beings. We have inalienable human rights, and that we need, when we're experiencing negative things in the system, we need to tackle that on a rights-based approach, rather than throw up our hands or just not engage or be angry. Now, anger is not a bad thing, but anger should be advocacy. So we should be learning to use our anger in a rights-based way, and also be aware we have rights. I wasn't aware. When that housing person said to me I'd made myself intentionally homeless, I was like, oh, okay, then I'm just a rubbish person, rather than, oh, I actually have a right to be housed. So it's that sort of stuff as well. And we're doing a lot around advocacy. We've got a network called NRAN, which is the National Recovery Advocacy Network, which is working with people to skill them up in rights-based advocacy with Reach Advocacy, which is also a lived experience-led organisation. And a number of these advocates are actually placed in independent advocacy organisations across Scotland to try and encourage the community to come in and access advocacy. And then my big area of work is, I must remember prisons as well, but my big area of work is all around lived experience. And trying to build both a network, learn lived experience representative network, to bring people with lived experience. And I think the important thing to say about lived experience is not, for me, it's not just about your experience, it's what you've learned from that experience, how that learning can inform where we go in the future. I think that's important. This is not about standing up and telling your story. That's valid. It has its place. Narratives of recovery are very important. But when I'm talking, I suppose in my role, I'm talking about using what you've learned to improve, to change, to make things better. And so it's a wider lived experience than your own personal recovery. And so it's also perhaps representing other people's experiences as well.
So do you see it in its political sense then, that people with lived experience are able to influence maybe service design, service delivery, policy? Is that actually happening, do you think?
It's increasingly happening. I mean, we're at the stage, I think, the Scottish government now, certainly when we work with them on various things, will always include lived experience. And what we've got to work is to go from the token thing of the past, which I was involved in, which is service user stuff, which again is important. But I felt millions of times that I was just shoved into a meeting, didn't know what was going on, didn't know why I was there. Sometimes I was just there to sort of tell my story and bugger off. So we're talking about skilled, professional experts by experience coming in and using their knowledge to change policy, to look at how treatment is delivered across the board, to look at, because it's not just about addiction recovery either, it's about our experience spans, we've experienced so many things. So we've had experience of criminal justice, of mental health, blah, blah, blah. And it's not trying to battle people. It's trying to say our experience can make what you do better. And it's valid. It's really, really valid. Learned experience is valid. The college and learning and university knowledge, and that is valid. I'm not saying it's not valid, but equally, our experience is valid, because we need to bring those two together. Because I believe it's actually better for professionals, in inverted commas, and for the people who use services. So,
And of course, addiction doesn't discriminate. There's people in all walks of life who are dependent, addicted to substances and behaviours, I suppose, as well. So we've got that kind of thing, but it does impact on people so much more when you don't have resources, when you don't have housing, when you don't have these kind of things. So there is that. That's really interesting. I mean, I've raised this question with a number of people. One of them is about the amount of drug deaths and Scotland's terrible record at the moment. And this year's figures is looking bad. So I mean, what's your thoughts around that? Why do you think Scotland has such a bad record for drug deaths?
I think in lots of ways it's a kind of a historical legacy. I think Scotland has suffered more perhaps in terms of sort of the inequality of wealth, the inequality of opportunity. And if I want to frame addiction as I do, and I'm not saying it's the same for everybody, but for me it's about despair. So when you're in a place of despair, you need to change the way you feel. So for me, the drugs aren't the issue. It's the fact that we have a lot of people in utter despair who actually feel that there is no hope. So there's poverty of opportunity, poverty in poverty terms. There's a feeling of, what do I do? Where do I go? And a long, long history of that. So if you've, I come from the south. I come from Reading. which had money, plugged into it, new tech, new this, new that. So yes, it still has a drug and alcohol problem, but there isn't the same barriers that you need to overcome to become the kind of person you want to be. And I would say that I was lucky because I started from a point of thinking that maybe I could be what I wanted to be, even though I crashed and burned. But I think if you don't have that and you don't feel that, then why wouldn't you try to change the way you feel? Why wouldn't you? And we need to think about that even more than we think about drugs and that, because the substance is a tool to change how you feel. You need to work out why people are feeling, particularly the groups that we're seeing most affected by drug deaths. What are we doing wrong that they feel that their life is not worth living, I guess? It's about the soil, isn't it? It's that old Bill White thing. It's, if the trees are in bad soil, the trees are going to wither and die.
So, I mean, you mentioned it earlier as well, and I'm wondering what kind of role that other people in society can have, especially around stigma, because we know that that's re-traumatizing people. You mentioned the ACEs earlier on, your own adverse childhood experiences. If people have experienced that, and that can be, from a variety of sources, it could be, abused as children, neglected, parents who were addicted, all that kind of stuff. And this sense that you are lower than the rest of society seems to be, I mean, do you think it's actually systemic? Do you think it's a system problem? I mean, you mentioned your own experience with housing, and do you think that's getting any better?
No, I think it's systemic. I think it's something. I mean, these are just my thoughts. It's something to do with fear of the other. And so what's happened is that a lot of our services have become stigmatizing themselves because they're gatekeepers in a sense. And the way you make decisions when you've got very little resources is to other people and say, well, that person's not worth it. So it just sort of perpetuates this. Mm-hmm. Whereas we've got to get into a narrative where everybody's worth it. And it sort of strikes me a bit that a lot of people don't know that sort of work. We were talking about David Best before we started, the notion of better than well.
Yeah.
So if you get people into recovery for 5 years, they become better than well. They become, these great model citizens. They become great parents.
But some do.
Some do. Yeah, some do. Myself, not a model citizen, but I'm trying. I'm still trying. 13 years.
Yeah.
But I don't think there's this notion of that you can, that getting people well is really important. And I still don't think people think that people could get well. That's, I think, at the root of it.
Yeah. There is this understanding that I think, or there's a belief that people have to hit an absolute rock bottom before they get well. And so there's all these kind of things, there's all these kind of archetypes that are going around. So again, making things visible through recovery walks, through the making recovery visible is what kind of helps with that kind of stuff. So yeah, it's challenging. I think this,
and we've got a really unhelpful narrative around. I mean, the big issue with drugs is the criminalization that goes along with it. So your odds are stacked against you from dot. Once you're in the criminal justice system, we all know how difficult it is to get out. So that's got a lot of issues. And I think with alcohol, you've got another set of whole issues, that it's so socially acceptable that to not drink is to other yourself and almost put yourself out of society. So there's lots of barriers that we need to other somebody. We need to make somebody bad in order to. And I still think that it's quite interesting. I'm doing a lot of work with other leaders of lived experience in other organizations. And we're having the same battles as people from Black and ethnic minority groups had, people with disabilities used to have, people with mental health. And it's almost like as we've learned to be much more understanding and open about those things, it's pushed people with addiction issues right to the bottom again. because it's easy to stigmatize those people. So we've got like that double whammy as other groups get more recognized as being worthy, which we all are. Another group tends to get pushed down, and a lot of that's the work we've got to do. I think we haven't got to, but we do stigmatize ourselves sometimes. We've got to learn not to self-stigmatize.
Yeah. So you talked about David Best and this notion of better than well, and I know I've talked about it in previous, but you just want to say a wee bit about that and what, you know, how that works, or you know, just what.
I'll do it in my own words, because
yeah,
this is the way that I sort of, and it comes back to something someone once said way back in the midst of time, and I can't remember when it was, but it was an NHS thing, and he was talking about illness as an asset, right? Which is interesting. So the illness as an asset is that once you've been ill and you've got well, you've learned. Okay, so you learn a lot of things about keeping well, and in fact, you're probably better at doing that than someone who's either never been ill or doesn't recognize that they're ill.
Yeah.
So that's at the root of it for me. So better than well is after 5 years, you've learned so much about keeping well, your mental health, your physical health, being a good person, nurturing your spiritual side, that you're actually better at looking after yourself than the average person. You know, that kind of, because you're better at looking after yourself, you tend to be a better employee, you tend to be a better parent, you tend to be you volunteer because you know you've got to give it away to keep it. So that's how it works for me. And I know that if I could have, say, drunk safely, I would have been a lot sicker than I am now, because I would still be using alcohol. I would still be doing that thing of waking up in the morning, doing the walk of shame and stuff. But because I've been unwell, I know that that's not the solution. And I also know other ways to keep myself well. And I feel I'm a better person, not perfect by any means, but a better person, a better member of society, a better friend, a better recovery activist, because I know what I need to do. And I know what's wrong for me, and therefore and what's wrong for my community. You know?
Yes. Yeah. So just on that subject, so what, if you didn't mind sharing, what kind of things do you as you know, someone in recovery who I'd imagine your job at times can be quite pressured, quite high pressure. You're dealing with government on one hand, you're dealing with, you know, health boards and a whole range of different things. So how do you keep yourself well?
I don't think this is going to surprise you, John. What we talked about before. Do you know what? And this is going to sound really, but it's true. For me, it's been my dogs.
Yeah.
So when I first got into recovery about a year in, I got my first dog. Now you'll notice that dogs multiply, because I do recognize myself. I still recognize myself as an addict. So one is never enough, but it's okay as long as I keep it in control. But I think one of the things that for me is when I first got into recovery, I felt so unloved, unlovable, useless.
Yeah.
My anxiety was raging. I felt like I couldn't do anything. And Sprocky, unfortunately, he died just before Christmas last year. But he loved me, and he didn't care. He didn't care at all if I'd been this, that, and the other, if I had anxiety and I wasn't the best person in the world and I wasn't this. And through that love, I was able to start to love myself. So that side of things, that deep relationship that's based on unconditional love, that doesn't matter who you are and what you've done. And then the second thing has been sort of my real belief in recovery. You know, we don't talk about, you know, it's real for me, and I'm angry, I suppose. Maybe it's anger a little bit that's kept me going, because I'm still angry that people aren't getting the chance to see it. And I'm not saying everybody has to go in recovery. It's all personal choice here, but the option should be available to everybody. And I don't want anybody to suffer like we've all suffered when they don't need to. So anger and dogs, John. Anger, dogs, and that sheer joy of being out with a dog in nature. I've also got 14 rescue chickens. So there's definitely a theme there.
You beat me to the chickens. They were coming. They were definitely coming.
Yeah.
But it's interesting because when we spoke beforehand as well, we talked about, you know, dogs getting you your comfort zone and stuff like that. So having a pet, I mean, that kind of leads on to some of the stuff. You mentioned William White a wee bit earlier as well. And we know from the evidence base that William White and others have produced that you know, there's a range of things that can help us keep well, and you know, it's been various. Oh, look at that! That's the one with the beautiful eyes as well, isn't it?
She's a little stunner, actually.
All right, okay. What's her name?
Her name's Cici.
Cici, yeah.
She's a Serbian rescue, so there's a theme there as well. She's in recovery.
Yes. So this notion that these things, which might surprise some people because they immediately think, right, I need to stop drinking, I need to stop drugging and stuff like that. But it's maintaining the thing that can be, you know, that recovery journey. And so, you know, I'm not sure if it was Bill White that first coined the term recovery capital, but certainly I think it was the first time I'd come across that term. We used it a lot in recovery coaching. We used it a lot around the Serenity Cafe and stuff. Is that a proposition that you hold to, that we need these elements in our life, or a variety, and it's different for everyone?
It's absolutely. I mean, for me, it was like when, again, this is the way sort of I understand recovery capital is. So when this journey first started, there was nothing between me and the drink, and the recovery capital has been the things that keep me away from that. And in the way, the drink's gone now, but it's all about the capital. So it starts with something small. It starts with finding, it could be the fellowship, that could be something you love. It could be art, it could be whatever, but it's finding something you love that gives you a little bit of that capital that takes you just a bit away. And then it's adding to that as time goes on. Yeah. So yeah, I definitely agree. And it's kind of, you can't get people to stop something if there's nothing else to replace it. Yeah. So you've got to find things to replace it, but it's not a one size fits all. You know, it'd be lovely if I could come out today and say to everybody, I've got the solution to addiction, get a dog. Yes. It's not going to be that, you know, it's not that easy.
No.
But what you can, in a way, the solution is trying to find something that you love more, maybe. You love so much that you want to be in your own life. Yeah. You don't want to not be in your own life, that you want to be present for. And that can be present for the fellowship, that could be present for smart recovery, that could be present for dogs, it could be for gardening, it could be for your mate, but something that makes you want to be here, not here. Yeah. And that's hard to find, but once you find one, then you find another and another and another. Yes. And that's how you stay in recovery, I guess. For me, that's how it's worked.
Yeah, that's really interesting as well. I've met a lot of people. The worst kept secret in the world. I love yoga. I came to it really quite late. You know what I mean? And I came to it at a time where it wasn't a great time in recovery because so much was happening, so much, and it was affecting my mental health pretty bad. But what I found from that was another tribe, because you mentioned tribe earlier as well, and I think that's important for me. I found another group of people who were trying to keep well, and they'd done it through, you know, yoga and stuff like that. And then what I found surprisingly in that family, or in that grouping, is a lot of people who were actually in recovery. They were using yoga as that vehicle for recovery, and from mental health, from emotional, you know, real bad times, addictions that we would know as well. So there's this whole other thing, and I've seen it in church groups as well, and choirs. There's so many people who have, you know, found a way out, and that's what they do to maintain that. That's their notion, or my notion, of their recovery capital. But
absolutely,
I think
it's finding your community, isn't it? It's finding we're so disconnected.
Yes.
And it's finding your connects, and those connects can be different for everybody. But it's not just the yoga, it's not just the dog, it's the connections that you make through that. So I talk to people out on dog walks who I would never talk to usually. Absolutely. And we're a community.
Yeah.
You know, we're a different community, but we've got a hell of a lot in common. And then, you know, my recovery community, that's a different one. And then there's other ones, and then there's And sudden, it's all about the strength. So maybe recovery captain is about the strength of your connection.
Yes. Yeah. And I think that's things like hobbies and interests are an amazing thing as well, because they often go with your addictions. You know, you kind of lose track of all that kind of stuff, and finding that kind of passion about things can really help lift you from that. You know, often the depression, because it seems like, and I don't know if you felt this, but it feels like your whole world's maybe going to come to an end, because all you've ever known is the drinking or the drugging or whatever for a long time. That's maybe been your life, and then suddenly to give that up, it seems like a huge loss.
And you've got to grieve.
Yes.
You know, it's a grief process. You are giving up something that was a big part of your life. It's might not. It's a bit like sort of a really bad relationship, isn't it? It doesn't mean, you know, when you divorce, it doesn't mean that didn't happen.
Yeah.
You know, even if it wasn't very good for you, you still grieve the loss of that. And I think that's what we need to learn, and you know, professionals and systems need to learn that it's not enough, that success isn't stopping. Success is enabling people to build some sort of capital to keep them going.
Yeah.
And you know, the more I sort of reflect back, why is alcohol not a big part of my life anymore? It's because I've got better things. You know, much better things. It's not a moral. It's not, you know, it's not a moral judgment on people who drink. It's not a moral judgment on people who take drugs. It's just let people explore what's better, and we don't do that very well. And then we punish them, and we punish people for being in distress. And I think it's very empty at first. I mean, I remember when I first stopped drinking, I couldn't believe there were so many hours in a day. You know, it just seemed endless. And what do you do if you're not drinking? What do you do? But now I look back and think, God, blimey, now the days just go like.
Yeah. I mean, you mentioned a wee bit earlier about kind of working within the kind of prison estate, or working within the criminal justice and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And again, we maybe see that compounded. You know, a lot of people in our not just within the prison service, but the looked after system with younger people and stuff, you know, the part addictions and dependency have had on those people, you know, maybe from their parents right the way through. And it seems to be getting more and more compounded. I mean, would your own, and I recognize this is your personal stuff, but I mean, drug policy reform, is that something that you've been interested in for or what?
Absolutely. I mean, I've spent I was originally I had to step down this year just because of work. I was on the board of Recovering Justice.
Oh yeah.
Which is a sort of small organisation looking to change that. We have sort of links. I have personal links. This is very much on a personal level, because the SS doesn't necessarily get directly involved. But no, I mean, I am appalled by drug policy. I'm appalled by criminalising despair. I did a lot. Back in England, I went into a lot of prisons, and I just thought, you could just look around the room and go, adverse childhood experience, adverse childhood, you know, and that is something we should not be doing. Same as the level of incarceration in America. It's, you know, and I still think, and this might be a bit controversial, but you know, the hidden harm of alcohol is immense, and it's legal. The hidden harm of drugs is related large, you know, from the health side but even the health side is related largely to its criminality. You know, you could if you had medical grade heroin for people, you know, you could live quite a
sustainable life.
And why shouldn't you? But you know, alcohol is a bugger. It really, you know, it will kill you. So for me, I've always come from drug policy reform, I think, from that alcohol perspective, that we say alcohol is fine, and yet I see the harm that it does, and drugs are terrible, and we're going to criminalize people, when actually I think the balance of harm maybe isn't quite the same. It's a bit like, you know, when Professor David Nutt said,
but riding horses is a bit...
exactly, you know, but we can't get real about that.
Yeah.
We've
Yeah.
got to start to get real. And we also, you know, that, yeah, I'm a big reformer, and I think we've created a horrible system where people are dying needlessly because we haven't got a hack, because they're using adulterated substances and blah, 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 blah. And I just think we need to just get a bit more grown up about this and say, yes, people will take drugs. You know, it's perfectly okay to do that. However, we need to make sure that people can do it safely.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that probably sounds a bit weird coming from a recovery person.
I don't think so. I think more and more.
For me.
Yeah. Yeah. I remember getting some kind of feedback when I took the job at Crew 2000, you know, and it was like, but wait a minute, they're not abstinent. They're not an abstinent. It was like, no, this is about harm reduction. This is about, you know, a continuum. You know, it's like,
Absolutely.
and I got into the same problem with the BBC at one time when I was doing an interview, and it was like, wait a minute, I says it's not either or, you know.
No.
I've got people who are in recovery who have relapsed, and I didn't want them to go back to the crap that's on the streets. You know, I'd much rather there was, you know, and for everybody it's different. For everybody it's different.
Yeah, it becomes a bit like moral, doesn't it? It becomes a bit moral for me. I didn't get into this to moralize to other people. I got into recovery because, you know, I didn't want to say what they did was wrong.
Yeah, yeah.
And I think that's where I got a little bit unhappy with. It wasn't the recovery movement itself. It never came from the community, but it came from people who co-opted that recovery is all about abstinence.
Yes.
It may well be. It may well be. I'm abstinent, but I still smoke, so I'm in recovery. Well, that's another question.
Yeah, yeah.
But it can be about abstinence. It can be being totally, completely clean, like some of the Americans, you know, who are like, don't drink caffeine and only eat raw food and they're super healthy. Good on them, great.
Yeah.
For other people, it can mean something completely different. It's not for us to judge. What is for us to do is to support people on that journey towards wellness, whatever wellness means for them.
Yeah.
And criminalizing people for distress is not part of that.
Yeah.
It's just not part of that for me.
Yeah.
And people need to be safe and alive so that they can look at all the options that are open to them.
Yeah. So I was asking the clinical lead for one of the community addiction services recently what he thought that people with lived experience brought to the table when we were looking to design new services, or even to look at existing services and maybe monitor or evaluate them. What would be a skill set, or what would they bring to the party, people with lived experience? And I know that this is part of your job at the moment. So how would you answer that one?
I think there's two things. I think there's one thing on a sort of systemic level. I always go back to, like, I wouldn't put a new product on the market until I'd tested it on people and said, oh, this is the best chocolate bar you're ever going to have. And if everybody goes, you know, I'm not gonna do it. Yeah. And I think the problem is that we create systems, and maybe with the best will in the world, but from one perspective, you know, I like this chocolate. This chocolate's great for me as a professional, and everybody coming in to taste that chocolate is going, this is bloody disgusting. And we often design services from a professional perspective, 9 to 5, for example.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, all those sorts of things. Really good reasons. I'm not saying they're wrong, but actually we need to rethink that, because we need to rethink if we want to get people to use services, which ultimately I think we all do, because they have a really strong place to pay. We need to design services that people want to come to.
Yeah.
And I don't think we've got that right.
Yeah.
And I think that's the same. I don't think that's just the same that's just in addiction. I think it's the same for any of us, actually. I've got an elderly relative. You come into contact with services there, it's a nightmare.
Yeah.
So, you know, it's something that they're all designed from a professional perspective to be objectives and professional needs. Then we need, but that doesn't mean that they're usable or workable.
Yeah.
And often they're not.
Yeah.
So there's that sort of systemic perspective. But also I think, people call this the fluffy stuff, and I hate it. But this isn't just about a clinical response to a problem. There are elements of love and spirituality and all those sort of things that need to be encapsulated in the system. If the system can't do it, it needs to back off and let us do it and work with us to do it. And I think that's some of the challenge as well that we're having at the moment. Very interested. I'm doing some work with David Best and Ed Day, the recovery champion, and Dave Hyam and various people looking at lived experience recovery organisations, and let us do that bit. Let people in recovery or allies of recovery deliver the bit that we all know that's important, which is what clinicians would see as, oh my God, no, don't talk about love. That actually we know is vitally important. So how do you bring the human to the system? And I think that's where lived experience has its place, because every single person I have spoken to, and I've spoken to thousands of people over the 13 years, put their recovery mainly down to the things that services don't provide.
Can you give an example of that?
Community, access to the fellowships, love, spiritual awakening, faith, yoga. I know some services do provide that, but do you know what I mean? It's not all about medication, and it's not all about sitting in a group, and it's not all about one-to-one counselling. It's also about the wider community, being connected, feeling loved, going on a recovery walk, going to a fellowship meeting if that's what floats your boat. It's most of recovery happens out with the services. The services can facilitate that, but they don't always do that.
Yeah. And in some instances, they're actively discouraged from going down that for. So
my experience was, and it has improved maybe, my experience was that recovery was never even talked about.
Yeah.
I was never encouraged to connect out with the service. It was almost frowned on, that you were sort of, you shouldn't really be going and doing things on your own. It might be risky. Oh, you shouldn't talk to other people who might have the same problem as you do, because they might make you relapse, so it was discouraged.
Yeah.
So I probably rambled a bit there, John. I forgot.
No, that's really useful. And it reminded me, I was in a joint services meeting with health and social work and stuff like that, and voluntary sector were there, and one of the services, it was at the start of the Scottish government's move towards recovery. It was before the Consortium was set up and stuff like that as well. But the road to recovery policy was being rolled out, and we were sitting around this table, and there was a couple of the people from Comas who set up the Serenity Cafe sitting there, and this person pontificated that, wait a minute, we've been doing recovery for 20 years, and stuff like that. The guy, from recovery slapped his hand on the table. He went, I was at your service for 10 years and nobody ever once mentioned recovery. Not once. It's like, and it just shut the meeting up. I was like, and that's the actual truth.
Yeah.
Before that time, before, the last 10, 12, 13 years, things like that, it wasn't mentioned. I was completely kind of undercover as a manager in drug services, because recovery wasn't talked about. Wasn't it?
And that's the other thing. That's a really good point, John. There is so much lived experience in services as well, and we need to unlock that. I could not believe when the person from services who made the influence most on me was someone who said to me, please don't say this because I'll lose my job.
Yeah.
But I'm in recovery.
Yeah.
And I was like, wow.
Yes.
Wow. And hopefully that's changed, but I still know that some people feel that they're not allowed to disclose. And I don't really understand that.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not just unlocking the lived experience outside organisations, it's unlocking the lived experience in organisations.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
that's exactly
how I got very well either.
No, that's exactly how I got into recovery as well. And it was the director of it was a charity that I was volunteering in. And he told me about his own lived experience of being on the streets of London. And now, I knew the guy was telling the truth. There was a resonance, I felt, it wasn't just somebody talking. It was like, I got what he was saying. And that's what got me from, kind of being where I was at to actually, it's almost like the slipway into recovery. It was like hearing somebody that I respected, that I knew wasn't bullshitting me, and that made a hell of a difference. Now I don't know what that organisation's policy were around that. It was a voluntary sector. It worked with prisons. It worked with people with lived experience in prison as well. So, but it was fascinating, and I think you're right. I think within most of the major service providers and services, we've now got a much bigger cohort of people with lived experience of all sorts, but particularly
they're an amazing resource because they've been on both sides of the fence.
Yes, yeah.
You know, they're an absolutely. We often think of lived experience as being out with. It's not. It's with. And we were talking about this the other day. You know, most of the big organizations started off with a few people with lived experience, with passion.
Yeah.
What happened along the way is they lost it. They became big corporate entities. So what can we learn from that? I think what we can learn from that is that lived experience actually drives most social change, but as organizations get bigger and it becomes more one size fits all, they lose it and they press it down. And then that's when I think they lose their efficacy to an extent.
Yeah.
Whereas if you liberate the lived experience, you will, by the nature of the beast, have more responsive organizations.
Yeah, that's really good. Yeah. So listen, this has been fascinating. I knew it would be.
Great, actually. Sorry, I've rambled on so much.
You've not, honestly. It's been really good. It's been really, no, it's right to the point. This is the magic wand, so I'm going to pass it to you. Yeah, you know, in terms of, it could be your work, it could be your own lived experience. If this was a magic wand and you had it, and you could make society different or one thing different, what would be, and maybe a couple of things that you could say? Money's no object. I forgot to mention that.
Okay, one thing I would do is introduce a universal basic income, which I know is being considered, and I know there's pilots, but I think if people have the opportunity to not be in poverty, I think that would make a huge difference to everybody. I think poverty is at the core of this, and not just poverty money, but money does help. If you are secure and you are able at any point to look after yourself and not have to have that pressure, that would make a big difference to me, that nobody ever had to fall off the cliff. Because that's what we're facing with COVID. We're facing people falling off the cliff, and we are going to see, as a result of that, a rise in behaviours, be it drugs or alcohol or gambling or domestic violence, because people haven't got security. They haven't got that one bit of security where they can say, hang on, I need to step off the world and work on myself to get well. So people keep going, or people fall into despair. So it seems a bit unrelated, but it is to me. You know, if we had to say, I suppose it goes back to what I said at the beginning, John, if there was a safety net, would that make a difference? I don't know is the answer, but I would hope it would. If there'd have been a safety net for me, maybe it would have made a big difference. And the second thing, I suppose, if I had a magic wand, God, bloody hell. I was supposed to say something like world peace and blah, blah, blah. If I had a magic wand, I suppose I would like recovery to be a reality for everybody, whatever that recovery was. I would like everybody to be able to fulfill their full potential and not feel bad or crappy because the world is a difficult place to be, and us to have an open conversation about that and say, look, it's not bad or crappy to do that or to do this. There is a better, you can, not better because that sounds a bit judgmental, but you can be the person you were supposed to be, maybe.
Yeah, I think that's, I mean, you've talked about it quite a bit, about this notion of unlocking potential, you know, and while you said that within service or whatever, but within every individual, the potential that they have is tremendous. And most of us don't believe that.
Yeah.
A lot of the
we
time.
See that.
Yeah.
We see that every day, don't we? We see that every single day. People who are, oh, that's the dog. People who are just living their lives who 10 years before would have been written off.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. And that's a bit of the idea of these talks, as well as that inspiring recovery journeys, you know, to help people understand that, you know, there's the world, they used to always say it, the world's your oyster, you know, if you can get into recovery, you get well, you start to kind of look at what your opportunities are and maybe start believing in yourself as well.
Yeah.
That's the person I've most got to convince is my own head, you know, quite often.
Yeah.
Listen,
Oh no, that's 100%. That's a whole other bloody conversation, the inside of our heads. But
I remember somebody saying, like, you know, I need to get you in my head. It's a dangerous neighborhood, you know. It's
absolutely, don't go in there alone.
Yes, that's right. That's what I love about the, you know, certainly the fellowships. Another thing is that recovery humor almost. There should be a program about. There should be books about the recovery humor, because very often that's what gets through to people, where fist banging and kind of morality and judgments didn't work. A bit of humor can cut right through that bullshit.
Absolutely.
Really, really impactful.
And you know, that's a really good point as well, John, because this is funny.
Yeah, yeah.
We're the most funny people, really. You know, the most horrible things that we've done and whatever, we look back with humor. Everything's funny in retrospect. That's what I've learned.
Yes.
Until it isn't.
Yeah.
Until it isn't. And that's the problem that we've got, is we're not getting enough people. Going back to the drug desk, we're not getting enough people to the stage where they can look back and go, God, you know, I was an idiot. You know?
Yeah, I was crazy there. Yeah. What was the what was the thing
that
there?
was bonkers.
You mentioned something right at the start, was that jump up to Manchester. And I've got a mate that I've got a mate in recovery who says that about, he says, it seemed like a good idea at the time.
At the time.
Everything seemed like a good idea at the time. And
At the time, yeah. And it
so
all
much,
did. And it's like, where did that come from? How did I make that decision? But there you go.
Yeah, I joined the army to get away from drinking. I know it seemed like a good idea
at the time, yeah.
But listen, pal, it's been lovely talking to you, and yeah, no, I really liked it. So, and you know, I'm sure our viewers will love it as well. Thank you so much for agreeing to do it. And yeah, so any last words for our audience?
Yeah, I think we've said it all, haven't we? I just to remember the phrase. It seemed like a good idea at the time.
If that's what's come out of this, that's brilliant. So I'm just going to switch off the now. Thank you so much from us for doing it, and I'll catch you soon.